Welcome back to Dr. M's podcast, and you're listening to Lonnie Wilson, who's going to talk to us on Deming, his deeper message. And in this session, he'll be talking to us about the history of Dr. Deming, his changing roles from the period 1900 to 1940, 1940 to 1980, 1980 to 1988, and 1988 to 1993. So, taking you over to Lonnie, and you hear from him. It's very, very interesting. Here we go. Welcome to Dr. M Wadcast, a wadcast with a mission, connecting continuous improvement professionals across the world.
Okay. Now I want to go through Dr. Deming's history, and some of this, I hope this doesn't get too slow, but it paints a picture of the type of person that he was and where he came from and what he did before we knew about him. Basically, before 1980, unless you were in a small group of statisticians or worked for the Department of Agriculture or worked at Western Electric, you probably never even heard of Dr. Deming. He was unknown. Meanwhile, he was a hero in Japan, and he was a hero in several other countries. But in the United States, he was an obscure figure until 1980. But in his history, he was born in 1990 in Sioux City, Iowa. Okay? His family quickly moved to Wyoming. They had a small farm in Iowa that was owned by his mother's parents. They moved to Wyoming, grew up, Powell, Wyoming, to be exact. He then began a very aggressive educational program. Okay? He attended college at the University of Wyoming, got an electrical engineering degree. He taught there at the University of Wyoming, and he was continuing his studies. Okay? So now we see the first piece of his working, which is teaching. And he did that all his life. In June, 2 years later, he becomes an assistant professor of physics at the Colorado School of Mines. Okay, so now he's a professor. He's at the Colorado School of Mines. He's still teaching and he's studying. Okay, and he earns his master's degree in physics and mathematics from the University of Colorado, yet a third school. Okay, so now he's got a master's degree in physics and mathematics, and during that time, the years 1925 and 26, those 2 summers, while he was studying for his advanced degrees, he went to work as an intern at Western Electric, Hawthorne plants in Chicago. Now, many people say he worked with Dr. Deming at that time. That's simply not true. He probably heard of Dr. Deming. You couldn't be at Western Electric without hearing about Dr. Schuhart, pardon me. But he certainly was not working with Walter Schuhart. Okay? I think I said Deming. He was not working with Walter Schuhart, but he certainly had heard of him. Okay. In 26, he goes to Yale to pursue his doctorate in mathematical physics. Okay. He is formally awarded the degree in 29 and 28, but his dissertation is on the packing of nucleons in the helium atom. Not management, not statistics, not quality, but physical chemistry, literally. And actually, it has a lot to do with statistics, with probability at any rate. Then in 1927, he graduates. He graduates from Yale. He doesn't get his degree officially until 28. Probably had to do with getting his dissertation approved. But he takes a job with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He was offered a job at Western Electric, and he turned it down. Okay, but luckily, his boss in D.C. was a personal friend of Walter Schuhart. They lived in the same building in New York, and so this fellow connected Deming to Schuhart, and he visits Schuhart on many occasions. Now they're not working together. He visits him, and he's learning about his theory of statistics and the things that he's doing at Bell Labs. In 1930, he starts lecturing at the U.S. Department of Agriculture Graduate School. He brings in many thinkers of the time to lecture at the university, and he writes dozens of papers. Now, these papers are almost all about physics, okay? But in his later years, he starts talking about statistical methods. So 1930, now Deming's 30 years old at this time. He's still in the world of physics, barely in the world of statistics. Okay. Then in 1935, he begins teaching math. Okay. And he spends a year at the College of London. And at the College of London, he studies under great statistician. Ronald Fisher, Sir Ronald Fisher, was the statistician who developed the science of designed experimentation. Egon Pearson developed all kinds of stuff, but you probably heard of Pearson's correlation coefficients. And Jerzy Neyman was a Polish mathematician and statistician who literally developed the concept of hypothesis thinking. Okay. And so he was with some of the giants of his time. Okay. And he contributes to the growth of statistics, especially in the area of sampling. Now he's getting into sampling theory. He's 35 years old. Okay. Then in 1937, he brings in Walter Shewhart to do a 4-part series. This is where he and Shewhart start to work together. Okay. And this 4-part series is a launching pad for statistical quality control. Up until that point, it had been pretty well isolated to Bell Labs. Now he got Shewhart to teach these classes at the Department of Agriculture. And then later, Deming edits and publishes a book that Dr. Shewhart wrote called Statistical Methods from the Viewpoint of Quality Control. If you're interested in the study of quality control and statistical quality control, you need to read that book. It's a tough read, let me tell you. Get ready to think and be very careful as you read through it. This is not something you're going to read at 200 or 300 or 400 words a minute, but it is jam-packed with genius. It's an incredible book. Then in 1939 to 46, Deming goes to work for the Census Department. This turns out to be very instrumental in his life because the census in 1940, people were complaining about the cost of the census because at that time they literally went around and counted heads. Okay? And Deming taught them the concept of statistical sampling. And in 1940, the census in the United States was made. Deming designed the statistical sampling methodology that they were using, and it turned out to be a landmark census. Okay? He became world renowned for that census, and that pivoted him in all kinds of work. But it was about statistical sampling. It's not management. It's not quality control. It's not using quality as a competitive method. It's statistical sampling. Okay, and in the world of statisticians and the world of census makers, he became extremely well known. Okay. Then in 1942, okay, the United States is in World War II. Stan Wallace of Stanford University volunteered to the Secretary of War and says, hey, we can help you improve your manufacturing methods. Now, those who study World War II will tell you that the reason the Allied forces won World War II was they outproduced the Axis powers. And one of the reasons was so much of the production was done in the United States, which was not under attack. But another reason was they employed statistical methods to improve both the quality and the productivity of what they could do. Okay? Deming participated in that. Wallace at Stanford was the head of the spear on the effort, but Deming participated in that, and he taught something like 20,000 students these classes, and he gave them what was called the 8-day classes. Okay? So that was Deming's real first application of teaching statistical methods as a competitive tool to the U.S. military. Okay, and it became very important when he went to Japan in 1950, and we'll come to that in a second. Okay? In in 1946, he leaves the government service to be a private consultant, and he becomes a professor at New York University. Okay. Now here is where his statistical sampling starts to come into play. He gets called by the Allies to observe the Greek elections to see if they're done fairly. Okay. He becomes a statistical consultant in sampling to the government of India again and now he starts traveling worldwide. Up until this point in time, he'd been in the United States, either at Stanford or New York or Wyoming, but now he leaves the shores of the United States and goes abroad. Okay, he becomes a member of the United Nations Subcommittee, United Nations Subcommission on Statistical Sampling. Okay. He becomes a delegate to the Indian Science Congress. Okay. In 1947, he is called to Japan by the U.S. occupation authorities. General MacArthur was SCAP, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. Okay? And they engaged Deming to help Japanese statisticians assess the problems of nutrition and housing in Japan and prepare for a census to be taken in 1951. For some reason that is not well advertised, in 1945, Harry Truman, the President of the United States, sent General MacArthur to help rebuild Japan. And that's a whole story in and of itself. But at that point in time, you've got to appreciate Japan was under martial law. The person who was running Japan was General Douglas MacArthur. And nothing happened in Japan without the approval of SCAP. And that's important to remember as we go forward. Okay. But Deming was requested to come over in 47 to prepare for a census that would be done in 51. Okay. When he was there, he met mostly academics. Okay. And they were impressed by what he said and what he did. And one of the things that impressed him was that he talked to them about the use of the statistical methods in the war effort. And many of them concluded that the reason they lost the war was because the United States outproduced them. And the reason the United States outproduced them was because of these statistical methods. That stuck in their mind. It gave them a rationale for why they lost the war. And it also kind of served their own purpose because most of these professors were statisticians. Okay? Well, then in 1950, he receives an invitation from Kenichi Koyanagi, who was then the president of JUICE, to come and teach these statistical methods in Japan. Okay, and but a lot of people say that that's why he went to Japan. That was only part of the story. We'll get into the rest of the story later. Okay, but then he continues his work while he's in Japan. He publishes his book on sampling. Okay. And then he writes his first book on the principles of statistical quality control, mostly based on his efforts with the military. He returns to Japan as a consultant in 51, again in 52, again in 55, again in 57, and several other times. I think he made 7 trips to Japan. Okay. He's a consultant to the Germans in 53. Again, he's a lecturer at several German universities. Again, statistical sampling. Okay. In 54, he's a consultant to the Census of Mexico. Okay. In 55, he's a consultant to the Central Statistical Office of Turkey. Okay. So this guy is going all around the world. He is a world-respected statistician, particularly in statistical sampling. Okay. He publishes a book on sample design. Okay. Again, you really don't hear very much about quality and quality control. It's all about statistics and statistical sampling. Okay. But he's at this time working with people and developing some statistical stuff, but not very much is happening on the big scale. He's a lecturer at the London School of Economics. Again, statistics. Okay. A lecturer at the Statistic Institute in Paris. Okay. He takes his 7th trip to Japan, and he sees the huge changes due to the implementation of his ideas and writes, "My 7th trip to Japan." If you want to learn about Dr. Deming, read that article. It's on the internet. My 7th trip to Japan. It's incredibly insightful. He talks about where he went, what he ate, who he talked to, the way he got around, the way people treated him, the way he treated people. It's incredibly insightful and gives you great insight to why the Japanese people literally revere him to this day. In 67, he publishes What Happened to Japan. Okay. And we'll go through its contents in just a minute, but basically what happened to Japan was not the transition and the development of management. It was not. Okay? In 1970, he was a consultant to China. He lectured in Argentina. He was all over the world, all statistical stuff. Okay. In 75, he retires from teaching and he becomes a professor at New York University. At this time, he is still consulting. He did a lot of consulting in the United States in transportation, a huge amount. Okay. Then in 1980, bingo, this is the flashpoint in his life. NBC airs the documentary, If Japan Can't, Why Can't We? On June 24th. That's the start of it all. Up until this time, if you're a statistician or you're involved in the census or you worked at the Department of Agriculture, you probably knew about Deming. But outside of those groups, very little was known about Dr. Deming. But they did about a 20-minute section on the end of it. Gosh, I wish I could remember her name there. Claire McCaskill. It's a double. Oh, I apologize. But she was the documentary the director, and Lloyd Dobbins narrated it as he did the Deming Video Library. But that vaulted him to instant prominence, and according to Seal Killian, his secretary, she said at that point our phone rang off the hook. He was an instant man. Okay. To get his message around, Deming began teaching his 4-day seminars and traveling worldwide to teach those. Okay. He published a book called Quality, Productivity, and Competitive Position in 1982. The same year, he publishes Out of the Crisis. And Out of the Crisis is basically just a rewrite of Quality, Productivity, and Competitive Position. Then in 1989, he speaks at the Institute of the Management Sciences in Osaka. Osaka, Japan. He goes back to Japan once again. And he talks about the obligations of management in the new economic age. That ought to ring a bell. Okay. This became the source material for his system of profound knowledge. And in the second session, we'll talk about how that knowledge was put together and how the book was written. And then in 1983, actually in 1992, he publishes, but then in 93, he republishes it, The New Economics. He founds the W. Edwards Deming Institute. Okay. And then in December 20th, 1993, Deming dies in Washington, D.C. To show you how dedicated he was to work, his last 4-day workshop was December 7th to December 10th. And my friend Bill Bellows attended that workshop. He was transported in a hospital bed. He was incredibly ill, but he continued to work. He literally could not stop. Okay. He starts as a poor guy working a farm and works to the last day of his life. Literally. Impressive man. Okay. Now let's talk about his changing role as a learner and a leader. I've alluded to various points of what he's done there, but basically from 90 to 94. Now keep in mind he's 40 years old at this time. He's still dealing with engineering, math, physics, and sampling theory. However, in the period 1940 to 1980, he expands. and he expands beyond sampling theory. He's still doing a lot of sampling theory. He's traveling to Turkey and China and everywhere. And but now he gets involved in statistics and quality theory, mostly due to his work with Walter Schuhart. Then in 80 to 88, he writes his 14 Obligations of Management, and he teaches his 4-day seminar. Bill Bellows told me that in the last several years of his life, his pattern was exactly the same. He would Tuesday morning, he'd take a train to New York. He would fly to somewhere where he'd do his 4-day seminar. Pardon me, Monday he would do that. He would do his 4-day seminar Tuesday through Friday. He would fly back to Washington, D.C. Saturday, he would do his laundry and catch up on his mail. Sunday, he would go to church. Sunday evening, he would go to Claire Mason McCaskill, I think is her name. Go to her house and work on some of his Deming video library, work with her on her book, literally. Then he would go back to Washington, D.C., pack his bags, and Monday head back to New York City. And he did that. That was his pattern every week. Did I mention on Sunday he went to church?
You did.
Went to church, and then he went to Claire McCaskill, Mason McCaskill's house. And then in 88 to 93, he got into what I call people-centric management. I think in the period 88 to 93, he was the most frustrated of ever in his life. Okay. So let's take some of these and summarize them and put them together, and so you can get a snapshot of these periods. His early years, his education, he worked with Schuhart. Okay. He took his education very seriously. He was brilliant. This is 1920, and he's getting a PhD. That was not very common. Not very many people went to college, let alone got a bachelor's, master's, and PhD. He was a voracious learner. He did summer internships at Bell Lab. He took the train from Wyoming to New York, to New Jersey. He teaches at the university level, goes to work for the Department of Agriculture. He becomes a world-renowned scholar in sampling theory. Okay. And that's his history. Okay. Now, the next phase is he meets Walter Schuhart, and his teachings expand. Okay. Charles Koonsman was a manager at the Department of Agriculture who was a close friend of Schuhart. Koonsman lived with Schuhart when he was in New York in the same building, and he introduced Deming. That's how Dr. Deming met Schuhart personally. Okay. And so Koonsman thought that the two of them had a lot in common, and they had a lot to hit off. So he introduced him, and Deming would travel to New York to meet with and talk to Dr. Schuhart. Okay. Then he works with Schuhart in the Department of Agriculture. Okay. He teaches these classes at Stanford University to support the war effort. This is his first real involvement in statistical quality control. And they developed what were called the 8-day classes. We'll go through those in a minute. Okay. Then he was invited by ESCAP to Japan in 1947, and again in 1950. Okay. And that's what he taught there. He taught the 8-day classes to hundreds, literally. Okay. He recognizes the need for management training. Okay. And that's where he ran across Ichiro Ishikawa, who's Kawada Ishikawa's father. What he did was he reflected on what happened to the teachings that he had done during the war effort. And he noticed that after the war was over, virtually everything that they taught was abandoned. And he said, of all the things that we taught, there was nothing left, not even the smoke. Okay. And he was terribly disappointed. And he drew the conclusion that we made the mistake. We should have taught management. Okay. So now he goes to Japan and he recognizes hey, we're with Koyanagi, we're teaching all these engineers and technicians. We got to teach the managers. Koyanagi says, hey, I know the guy. There's this one guy that's really powerful guy. His name's Ishikawa. And he got Ishikawa and Deming together. And Ishikawa made a few calls. And supposedly the next weekend, they had these 21 Japanese industrialists in a meeting in a hotel in Tokyo. And Deming told them about his philosophy, his statistical quality, how you could improve and how you could leverage it. And Ishikawa got these people together and they said, okay, we want to learn more. And so he started putting on special management classes for them, which was the same basic class with one or two things added. Okay. But that time that he held that meeting with the famous meeting with the 21 Japanese industrialists, it was noted that 80% of the entire industrial capacity in Japan was managed by one of those 21 industrialists. So when he spoke to these people in this hotel in Tokyo, he was speaking to basically all of the manufacturing industry in Japan. Okay. It was arranged by Koyanagi and Ishikawa. Okay. Deming was literally revered by the Japanese, and I could tell you tons of stories about things that he did, but he was incredibly humane and understanding. He spent time understanding their culture, and like I say, read that article about what happened in Japan. He visits Japan several more times. The Deming Institute says he made several meetings, but I know there was a couple more than that. Okay. The Japanese miracle gets documented. He gets lots of credit if Japan can, why can't we? Via the NBC white paper. And Deming becomes popular overnight. Okay. Those are the key points from 40 to 80. Okay. But I want to divert just a little bit and talk about the core of his teachings in Japan. This is not very well known to people. Most people think he taught his 14 obligations management. He did not. He basically taught the same 8-day class that they taught to the American industrialists when they're trying to improve the war effort. Okay. And his 8-day classes consisted of 4 major points. Okay. There's one he called an overall growth strategy, the chain reaction. The second one was manufacturing as a system, the flow diagram. The third one was management-driven continual improvement as a way of life, the Deming wheel. He called it the Deming wheel, which he learned from Schuhart. Pardon me. Later, the Japanese turned the Deming wheel into what we call PDCA. And even later, Deming wrote about it, and he called it PDSA, Plan, Do, Study Act. Okay. The fourth part of the 8-day classes was an introduction to the Schuhart control chart and management-supported statistical quality control. So I'll show you the 8-day curriculum here in just a second. But it was those 4 major points. Okay. Now, he calls this the chain reaction. This is the first point. Okay. And you find this in all of his writings. Okay. And this is important in terms of all of his subsequent writing, because it starts out with using quality as a competitive weapon. Improve the quality. Okay. Second, as you improve the quality, costs reduce. There's less rework, fewer mistakes, fewer delays, snags, better use of materials and time. Okay. And from there, productivity improves. Okay. As the productivity improves, and this is a key point that people miss frequently. He says, when you do that, you capture the market with better quality and lower price. He's talking about growth, making more available for more people. Why? Because it's better quality, it lasts longer, and it's cheaper. More people can get it. Okay. That's his growth philosophy right there. Deming teaches, he talks about a fixed pie concept. He's saying there is no fixed pie. Enlarge the size of the pie by using quality as a competitive weapon. When you do that, you stay in business and then you provide jobs. Now, most people don't think about him as that. That was big with him, providing jobs, providing security. Okay? That was his chain reaction. And when he taught that to Japanese managers, he said, if you follow this chain reaction, you will change your position in world economics in 5 years. And then he later, when he was in Japan, somebody said, hey, we did it in 4. So Deming said, I was wrong. Okay? His message from this day forward was based on providing the societal need. It's not about making money. You don't see profit in this equation. What do you see? You see capturing market and providing jobs. He's talking about using quality as a competitive weapon. He's talking about growing the business by focusing on the customer. He's talking about as the individual goes, so goes the business. And he doesn't state it very clearly here, but later he states it very clearly. He's talking about cooperation over competition. A very controversial topic that we'll talk about a little bit later. Probably a whole session, a Dr. M vodcast we could make on that one.
Sure.
Okay. The second thing he taught in his 8-day classes was the flow diagram. Now, everybody who studied Deming has seen this. Okay? But he's talking about it as a continuous system design. Suppliers supply material, production improves, you continually test and feedback information, consumers feedback information, you get consumer research, you improve the design and the redesign, and you start all over again. Okay, that's his flow diagram that he taught them. The third thing he taught was what he called the Deming wheel. And it's to design, make, sell, and service or test. Okay. This comes directly from his article, the 1967 article, What Happened to Japan. That's what Deming taught him. It wasn't a PDCA wheel. It wasn't a PDSA wheel. It was that wheel. Okay. It later morphed into PDCA and PDSA, but that was what his wheel was. And that came directly from the writings of Schuhart back in 1939. The fourth thing he taught him was the Schuhart control chart, which most people are familiar with. He taught them how to make it, how to use it, how to apply it. And he taught them a variety of other statistical techniques, but the heart of it was the Schuhart control chart. Okay, those were the 4 themes that he taught in his 8-day session, which were the 4 themes that were taught in the Stanford classes. Okay. Here is the written curriculum that they would give to people, and there's I don't know, there's like 10 points there, and then he would go through each of those 4 documents and tie in these points. And you can see his obligations of management in here. The customer is the most important part of the production line. Quality is determined by management. The consumer is most important. Your supplier is your partner. There's a chain reaction. Okay. There's a need for trust and cooperation between organizations. Okay. All of those things were part of his teachings. Okay. But was not part of his teachings. And he writes this in a memorandum that he gave, where he gave a speech. Okay. And he said, for example, in Japan in 1950 and beyond, what I tried to teach top management was not management, but problems in management of quality. They knew about the substantive part of management to weld statistical techniques into their thinking. I did not teach consumer research, but the use of statistical techniques in consumer research. The whole world knows the result. Okay. So he makes it very clear. He was not teaching management. He He was teaching statistical quality control and how to use quality as a competitive weapon to the Japanese. Okay? That article was written by him in 1971. Okay? He says, I didn't teach him management. He's very clear. Okay? Following his work in Japan, the historical record of Dr. Deming is very light. Okay? Until 1980, when Claire Mason McCaskill, I guess is her name, produced, and Lloyd Dobbins narrated, If Japan Can, Why Can't We? But we know some things. He continued his work on statistical sampling. He published frequent articles. I think in that time period, he wrote over 100 articles. He continued as a world-renowned expert among statisticians. And you can remember he went off to Turkey, he went off to Greece, he went off to India, he went off to China, he went off to Mexico. He went all over the world. Okay. He continued to teach and consult worldwide. He taught at Paris. He taught in Germany. Okay. He branched out into doing more SQC work with private clients. In this time, he started developing more SQC work, mostly based on what he'd applied in Japan and learned in Japan. And he became increasingly interested in the inadequacy of management. It's very clear from his writings that he was incredibly frustrated about this. He went to Japan and he got all of these things done. In half a dozen years, he turned Japan into, well, he didn't. He assisted in turning Japan into a worldwide industrial power. But in the United States, he's not even listened to. They don't even know him. Every year they have the Deming Prize in Japan. They invite him. He's a guest speaker. Okay. So he must have been incredibly frustrated. Okay. And maybe that's partially why the title of that document was, If Japan Can, Why Can't We? I think that expresses his frustration. Okay. And he attributed the problems to management. He found that in the States, management was his obstacle. In Japan, they were willing. They were ready, willing, and able, as he said. Okay. But I researched his articles, and let me extract from his articles a couple of comments that he had made over the years. Okay? So he wrote a 1954 article about Japanese management. And what he said was, management is today the most important and the most neglected of the four groups. He's talking about managers, suppliers, customers, and employees. Hence, I shall be more explicit with respect to it than to the others. With regard to the importance of talking to management, I may venture the opinion that the rapid progress that has characterized Japanese industry since 1950 arose in large part from a clear understanding and application for statistical methods on the part of a large number of Japanese executives. He makes it a point. If you want to apply these methods, you got to be Japanese. You need to mimic what the Japanese did. Okay? That was a 1954 article on teaching of statistical principles delivered to the International Statistical Society in Rome. Fast forward a few years, in 1967, he wrote an article, What Happened in Japan? I beg that you read that. That's fabulous. Okay. And here is an extract from it. He says 9 features of the statistical control of quality in Japan. Okay. I won't read the whole thing because it's long, but I'll take a couple of highlights. And he said 9 features. The first feature was genuine and resolute determination on the part of management to improve quality. That's point number 1. Okay. This is 1967. Okay. You don't see his frustration in that. Okay. But you see some things. He talks about confidence in their ability to lead Japanese industry forth. Okay. If you look at point number 5, just a sec, Doc. He says management took immediate interest and learned something about the techniques of the statistical control of quality as about the possible results, and still more, what their own responsibilities would be. Point 6, statistical education became a continuous process. Okay? Nowhere does he say, I taught them how to manage. But he did continually repeat the role of management. Okay? His ninth one is particularly revealing. Suggestions and technical information have a fairly clear channel from lower to higher levels of supervision and management. Notice he says from lower and higher. In other words, the managers are listening to the people below them. A Japanese executive is never too old or too successful to listen to the possibility of doing a better way. Another thing he's saying is they did that in Japan, but they're not doing that in the United States. Okay? And he doesn't really express much frustration in this, but if you read between the lines, you can see a lot of these features of statistical quality and control in Japan have to do with management acceptance and management involvement and management commitment. Okay? But he makes no mention of training the management other than in statistical techniques. But he's saying this Japanese miracle is all about statistical quality control. Okay. Now he writes an article in 1972. Somebody had asked him to make a report to management, and I neglected putting in the date there. I'm sorry. Somebody wants it, I can get it for him. Okay. But he says this report is written at your request, the person who hired him, after study of some problems that you are having with production, high costs and variable quality, which altogether, as I understand you, have been the cause of considerable worry to you about your competitive position. Please note that I write as a statistician who sees the statistical method as a system of service to science and to industry. I am not a management consultant. I am not a management consultant. Would you believe that statement after you read his book in 1982? Okay. As a statistician in practice, however, I work with management on many types of problems, including statistical logic and the management of quality. Thus, I learn what some management problems are and how statistical methods can help. Okay. He is clear. He is not a management consultant. Okay. He's a statistician. Okay. This is soon to change. Okay. He gets increasingly agitated with U.S. management. In 1975, he writes a scathing article, and it was on some statistical aids towards economic production in an article he wrote in 75. He said, one purpose of this paper is to present a number of new principles of training and administration that upset generally accepted conventions. The new principles had their origin in the author's work in Japan, which commenced in 1950. Another purpose is to point out to management that most of the trouble with faulty product, read this carefully, most of the trouble with faulty product, recalls, high cost of production and service, is chargeable to the system and hence to management. He's clear. Management is a problem. Effort to improve the performance of workers will be a disappointment until the handicap of the system is reduced. Okay. Later in this article, it was a long article, under the subtitle Roadblocks to Quality in America, he writes this, even more pointed. Management usually discharges its responsibility, sweeps them under the rug, by turning the job over to a Department of Quality Control. This would be a happy solution in good administration if it solved anything, but it seldom does. The job lands on people that try hard but have not the necessary competence, and the management never knows the difference. Wow. As a result, one finds in most companies not quality control, but guerrilla sniping. No provision or appreciation for the statistical control of quality in the broad sense of this paper. He has clearly changed his perspective. This is a turning point in his life or in his work. He was amazingly successful in Japan, yet he cannot get the attention in his own country. He's pointing his finger, rightfully so, directly at management. He has now become a management consultant. Everything he writes from this time has a management is the problem theme. His book, Out of the Crisis and the New Economics, define this even more. He doesn't take the point that management is the only problem, but he does take the point that management is the only group that can correct the problems. And therefore, they become the problem if they don't correct. Okay? He writes an article in 1986, I think this was before the republication of his book, but he has an abstract, and it's called Drastic Changes for Western Management. And in the abstract, I'll read this. He says, the biggest problem that most any company in the Western world faces is not its competitors nor the Japanese. The biggest problems are self-inflicted, created right at home by management that are off course in the competitive world of today. Systems of management are in place in the Western world that for survival must be blasted out. New construction is commenced. Patchwork will not suffice. He emphasizes this. The biggest problems are self-inflicted, created right at home by management that are off course. Part of this explains why he wasn't particularly popular with management. He was telling them they're the problem, and I doubt they really wanted to hear that. But he made it very clear. Okay. Now, this takes us up to 1980. Okay, and it takes us up to a real flashpoint in his life, which is the publication of if Japan can, why can't we? But I'd like to go through this and summarize it. Oops, pardon me. So first, Deming was extremely successful in his field, statistical sampling and education. He was an excellent teacher. He met Walter Shewhart and expanded his statistical background into quality. Okay. Later, he was asked to go to Japan for the census. Okay, and later to teach quality. Okay? He was a huge success in Japan. He's revered. Some of the things he did that endeared him to the people in 1947, when he went there, he was there for a few months teaching the academic statistical techniques. But every morning he would go to the American PX and get whatever his allotment was. Everything was being rationed, but he would go over there and he would get cigarettes and he'd get candy and he'd get fruit and he'd get canned goods and he'd get whatever he could. And then when he went to do his work in Japan, he would give it to the people. In 1947, they were literally starving. Okay? They didn't have enough food to go around. And acts like this made him incredibly popular. He would go and buy cigarettes. He didn't even smoke, but he would buy the cigarettes and give them away. People who did. Okay? He came back to the U.S., okay, and he could not duplicate his success. He reflected. In Japan, he had ready, willing, and able managers. They jumped at the chance. Ishikawa got these managers together. They elected to take the training, and then part of their training was to train the people below them, and they did that. They took Deming's material and taught him. Okay. In the U.S., he was not able to get an audience at all. They just the managers didn't match the ready, willing, and able Japanese managers in terms of willingness to do things. So he couldn't get beyond that barrier. But he had a burning desire to make an impact. And you can see that burning desire in his studies, in his works, in the individual efforts that he took. The things that he did were incredibly initiative-based. Also, how long he worked. He literally worked from his deathbed. At this time, NBC is about to publish its white paper, If Japan Can, Why Can't We? Okay. We'll pick up right there for session 2.
That's the end of session 1, and we now would move to session 2, which is going to be published very soon on Dr. M's YouTube channel and on Dr. M's LinkedIn page. So stay tuned and see you there.